So Ontario businesses, you just heard, bracing for some pushback, whether it's at a restaurant or gym or wherever a certificate is required. It will be the workers who will have to ask customers to prove they are immunized against COVID-19. And some employees are nervous about that, as you just heard. So to explore this angle of the story, let's bring in Muneeza Sheikh. She's an employment lawyer and partner at Levitt Sheikh LLP, and she joins me from Richmond Hill, Ontario. Muneeza, welcome to the Rundown.
Hi, Carol.
Do you think this is fair to ask employees to do this?
Absolutely not, Carol. What we're doing essentially is we're placing employees in a combative, scenario when that really isn't part of their job duty. Running security at the door is not something you should have to do as an employee. And, this is the narrative because we have the government saying, look, if there's any sort of dispute with respect to a vaccination passport, feel free to call law enforcement. And so it's quite reasonable for most employees to think, okay, this can get, pretty heated at the door. And maybe, if law enforcement gets involved, it could potentially even be a situation of, maybe a violent situation, although of course law enforcement is there to just deal with the vaccine passport as far as the government's concerned. But that really could potentially, Carol, expose employers to liability from their own employees who turn around and say, I don't feel safe anymore. And there are obligations under occupational health and safety legislation to keep your employees safe. And, a couple of those incidents at the door may put you in a situation as a small business where your employees are saying, I don't even want to come to work anymore.
Yeah, and if the employee, what would it take for that to be a legitimate reason for the employee to say, you know what, I'm nervous about doing this. I don't want to do this.
Sadly, the frame of reference would probably be an actual incident in the workplace. So look, keep in mind, using just restaurants as an example, it's been a pretty depressed industry during the entire pandemic, and people are now going to be frustrated, waiting in lines, having to show their passport. And, if there's a situation where, there's a bunch of people at the door, maybe only one of them is not vaccinated and isn't able to demonstrate that there's some loophole, things can get pretty ugly. So the best frame of reference would be an incident. And so an employee may turn around and say, not only do I not want to be put in that type of situation where I'm having to deal with something that falls far outside of the four corners of my employment agreement, but aside from that, I also don't want to get head to head with somebody who's not vaccinated. So, Carol, it could potentially be an ugly two-layered issue.
So let's say the employer says, look, this is part of your job. You have to do this. Just like you have to, it's the same as if you're at the front door and somebody's trying to run out with food that they didn't pay for. It's your job to try to be the gatekeeper to this restaurant.
I think it really depends as to who those instructions are being given to. If it's someone who's, in the back end of the business and they're now having to stay at the front end and deal with that issue, it might be a bit of a tougher argument. I think those employers, interestingly, some of my clients who can afford it are actually just hiring new people altogether just to run, that front end of the business. But I think it depends on what you do. That's a very good example that you raised. If it's something that kind of falls within the scope of what you already do and you're sort of rolling with the punches in terms of, new changes that this vaccination passport has put into play, you may have a weaker argument. But there are people, Carol, there are employees, I should say, Canadian employees who have a significant amount of anxiety around going to work now, around this vaccination passport and how it's going to be implemented, specifically because while the government had said, hey, go pick up the phone and call law enforcement if the issue if there is an issue, what the government hasn't given a lot of direction on is what are the guidelines in terms of a vaccination exemption? So if someone says, I'm too unwell, I'm sick, I've got a human rights loophole that prevents me from being vaccinated, how does an employer, enforce that or not enforce that? I mean, they're not qualified. You're not qualified and I'm not qualified. We're not physicians.
All right. Well, a lot of this requires, I think, there's so many questions that are unanswered right now, Muneeza. Is there an alternative to this, to fix this, or is this going to have to play out in the courts somehow?
I think what we can expect in the coming months is a significant amount of, contentious litigation around the issue. In a perfect world as an employment lawyer, Carol, what I would have liked to have seen is the direction coming from our legislators. So there should have been changes to regulations or laws which would give some guidance to some of these businesses as to, this is the protocol that you follow, this is what you do, and maybe some administrative bodies instead of police who were put in place to deal with any sort of issue at the door if someone's trying to get it with a vaccination passport. And what a lot of businesses are saying is, look, we're not getting any direction from the government, and what we're really doing is getting most of our information from the news. And Carol, that's not right.
Muneeza Sheikh is an employment lawyer and partner at Levitt Sheikh LLP. She joined us from Richmond Hill, Ontario. Muneeza, thank you.
Thanks, Carol.